Welcome everybody to the latest Talking About Socialism event. My name is Will McMahon. I help facilitate talking about socialism and I'm part of the steering group. This evening we are talking about water, why the capitalist class is unfit to rule. The privatisation of UK's water supplies and sewerage system by Margaret Thatcher in 1989 led to a boom in profit for private investors. While bills have soared, our water network is polluted beyond belief. So what's the answer to this? Should we let private companies continue to run the industry, poison rivers, lakes and seas, while the sewage system deteriorates even more? Is nationalisation the answer? What sort of nationalisation, if it is? Who'll run it and in whose interest? So introducing tonight is Wrack. He'll be talking for about 15 minutes or so. Then we open it up to contributions from the floor and people can speak for up to 3 minutes. We do it that way so that you might get 2 or 3 bites of the cherry. Do remember that we are live on YouTube and this is going to be recorded and kept on YouTube. So if you're thinking of saying anything litigious, don't. Otherwise, we'll have to edit. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Will. Thank you, comrades. Thanks for the introduction and framing the discussion. We are facing a water crisis in Britain. We're facing a growing water crisis in Europe, and a water crisis already exists on a daily basis for at least half of the world's population. These crises are caused by capitalism, a system that is based on the private ownership of the means of production and is driven by the need to make a profit for the relatively tiny class of owners through the exploitation of the working class, which comprises the vast majority of the world's population. This universal crisis is a consequence of class society, and it's a consequence of underinvestment or no investment by the capitalist class, the owners of private capital, or by capitalist states who represent the interests of the capitalist class. There's a failure to plan and prepare for the future, even in the advanced capitalist countries like the UK and in America as well. This crisis is being exacerbated by the global impact of climate change. In the UK, our rivers, streams, lakes and seas are open cesspits filled with untreated human and animal waste on an unimaginable scale, threatening our life and the environment, seeping into the groundwater from which about 1/3 of the water supply in England and Wales comes. Data from the UK's Environment Agency in August this year shows that almost 500 chemicals, some of which are banned, have been found in various mixtures across all 171 river and groundwater catchments tested in England in 2024. More than half of those pollutants are classified as very toxic, toxic, or harmful to aquatic life, according to the European Chemicals Agency. And a banned carcinogenic forever chemical was among 20 substances of very high concern found. Farm runoff was another major source of contamination, with approximately 30% of the substances commonly used as insecticides, fungicides, pesticides, and medicines for livestock appearing. Around 34% of substances detected are pharmaceuticals, caffeine, and sweeteners, which are probably discharged from inadequately maintained sewage treatment works. Pollution is literally killing the rivers and the creatures in them, and threatening our lives and the lives of generation to come. Crisis already faces half of the world's 9 billion population with intermittent or no access to clean water. Even major cities are facing what is referred to as day zero, when there is no water available. This almost happened in Mexico City this year, the largest city in North America with a population of 22 million. It almost happened to Cape Town in South Africa in 2018, affecting its 4.6 million inhabitants. In the European Union area, almost 2/3 of its surface water, rivers and lakes, are polluted, according to the European Environmental Agency. Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, which is also affecting its water supply. We regularly now see droughts in Spain, with water rationing imposed, and other areas such as Greece and Italy. After 35 years of water privatisation in the UK, the water and sewage system cannot cope with the needs of the United Kingdom in this, the second decade, or third decade, I should say, of the 21st century. It cannot protect the environment or guarantee our health. That is, in the world's sixth largest capitalist economy, this system, the capitalist system, cannot provide safe sanitation or guarantee the continued availability of water that is safe to drink or to bathe in. The profit of a very small number of private owners comes before the needs of 67 million people who live in Britain. The capitalists will poison the planet and everything on it and in it to make a profit. They will continue to do this unless we stop them. Yet, the new capitalist Labour government under Sir Keir Starmer will only tinker with the current system. Labour has decided to set up a commission to be chaired by a former deputy chairman of the Bank of England, Sir John Cunliffe. And that should tell you everything you need to know about what to expect from that review. Labour's Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, said that the review will carry out a, quote, root and branch assessment. He said, if we had had better regulation, I don't think the water sector would be in the state that it is in today. But he has explicitly and specifically ruled out nationalisation as an option. Instead, he wants more robust regulation. He said that the Cunliffe review will be, quote, the first comprehensive review of the sector for 35 years, seemingly forgetting that Labour was in power for 14 of those years under Blair and then Brown and did nothing. Reid correctly pointed that without intervention in the 2030s, in 10 years' time, the demand, this is a quote, the demand for clean drinking water will start to outstrip supply, and that means people won't always have access to clean drinking water in the way they currently don't in some parts of the Mediterranean. Yet all he calls for is better or more robust regulation. I'd welcome comments on that. Ridiculously, Reid said, quote, the whole water sector failed the public. That's correct. They failed their customers. That's also correct. He then said they failed their investors. Well, it certainly did not fail the investors, the shareholders, who have walked away with £80 billion over the last 35 years. £80 billion. paid out in dividends over the last 35 years. Reid and the entire Labour leadership are completely wedded to capitalism, to its profit system. Their priority is to make more profit for the capitalists, and they will regulate in a way that does not interfere with the water companies making the profit that it expects. We can expect nothing of use or benefit from this review or from this government. Regulation will inevitably be manipulated, mangled, and ignored by the water companies, whatever new regime is created. Sewage spills in England's lakes, rivers, and seas by water companies more than doubled in 2023. According to the Environment Agency, there were 3.6 million hours of spills compared to 1.75 million hours in 2022. Just think about that. On average, last year, 2023, there were 1,271 spills, that's of sewage, untreated sewage, a day across England, compared with 825 a day in 2022. Dry spilling, that's releasing sewage outside of heavy rain or flooding, is illegal. Yet it is deliberately and repeatedly used to discharge wastewater as a result of the industry's collective failure, or rather refusal, to invest sufficiently in their wastewater treatment plants. It makes more sense to them, that means it makes more money for them, for the companies to dump the waste illegally and face fines rather than to invest in improving the system and make the dumping unnecessary. Private profits, dividends, take priority over public health. When Margaret Thatcher privatised the water and sewage industry in 1989, the private water companies had no debt. They were literally given the assets worth billions. From no debt in 1989, the water companies have built up debts of 60.6 billion by 2023, according to Ofwat, the industry regulator. According to research by the Financial Times, the 16 water companies have paid out 78 billion in dividends in the 32 years between 1991 and 2023. If we take just one example, Macquarie is an Australian asset management company. Between 2006 and 2017, it was the biggest shareholder, the owner of Thames Water, the largest of the water companies, providing water and sanitation in London and the surrounding regions. In 5 of those 11 years, dividends exceeded the amount of profit the company was making, and debt quadrupled from £2.5 billion to more than £10 billion. Incredibly, Macquarie was allowed to take over Southern Water in 2021 after Southern almost went bankrupt. In July 2024, Southern Water paid its chief executive, Lawrence Godston, a bonus of £183,000, taking his pay for that year to £764,000. Its chief financial officer, Stuart Ledger, was given a £128,000 bonus, taking his total pay to £610,000. This was despite Ofwat describing its business plan, presumably drawn up by these two men, as inadequate and saying that it had to be rewritten. Ofwat said that it did not meet even, quote, minimum standards. Southern is on Ofwat's financial health watch list, along with Thames Water and South East Water. Southern Water wanted Ofwat to approve a 73% rise in household bills over a 5-year period to 2030. Eventually, Ofwat allowed bills to be raised by 44%. This will raise average water bills for households covered by Southern Water from £451 per household per annum to £722 per household per annum by 2030, after including an annual 2% increase for inflation. The same goes essentially for all of the other water companies who have asked for massive increases, but been allowed to increase them significantly to the detriment of the consumers. These water companies are regarded by their shareholders as cash cows, paying out huge dividends that they cannot afford. The chief executives are paid handsomely for ensuring that the dividends keep coming, even at the expense of no or minimal investment in the business. The dividends and the management's remuneration and bonuses will be paid for by the consumer, you and me. There's no overall nationally integrated plan for providing water and waste services. The infrastructure has deteriorated. Thames Water, which has got a replenishment of its waste pipes of 0.2%, it's estimated will take 500 years at that rate to replace them. It will take 170 years to replace its water pipes at that rate. So what's the answer? We cannot afford, as a people, as a country, as a world, to continue to allow private profit to determine whether we have access to safe, clean water. As socialists, we need to argue for public ownership, democratic public ownership, with democratic public control and management of the industry and democratic planning of the resources for the future. We cannot, however, argue to go back to the undemocratic, bureaucratic nationalisation that existed before Thatcher's privatisation regime. There we had nationalised industries that were not run or controlled or managed in the interests of the people, but managed, run, controlled by the capitalist state in the interests of the capitalist owners of private business. We can't look at nationalisation or public ownership, as I prefer to, common ownership rather, as I prefer to call it, in isolation. We have to look at water as an integral part of all aspects of the economy. Climate change, which I've also already mentioned, also has to be confronted. We have to have a plan for the whole economy, and that plan can't simply be national, but has to be global.
Okay.
The capitalist class has made a fortune from owning water as from owning other industries. They've had their time. They cannot deliver what humanity needs. It's time to get rid of them.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks for that. Yeah, that was a very good introduction, and yeah, really good. So we've got 3 minutes each, just to remind people that that we've had some latecomers. Just to remind you, you get 3 minutes, and you can have a second bite of the cherry, and then I'll bring Nick back in, and then we can have some more contributions. So, who would like to speak first? Minnie.
Yeah, thanks for that talk, Nick. In the UK alone, 67 million people come second to making profit. I mean, it's not even profit, is it? It's debt leverage, as you said about the 60 billion, and they're giving out more in dividends. So, I mean, what's happened to the money we paid for bills, hey? It's complete, utter, absolute theft. Yeah, I know what you said about in the world, and some people can't have water. I think was it in Syria, the parts of the fighting started because people came into the cities and couldn't find work, and that's because the Syrian hierarchy, royalty hierarchy, they were actually using the water for golf courses, hotel complexes, you name it, and that's going on in a hell of a lot of countries, which Nick intimated. Yeah, there's people in the States. Oh, one question I've got is there's something about a chemical that they can't get now because of Brexit. I don't know whether Nick's heard about that. And that's one of the reasons, one of the excuses they're using for polluting our rivers anyway. Also, we had to call United Utilities out. We're in the Northwest, and to have our access to water outside, the little tab you get outside, fixed. And it wasn't a priority because they were put in initially by water companies many, many years ago, because they wanted to be able to turn people's water off if they couldn't pay their bills. I thought that was really interesting, and just says it all. Yeah. So we've got an infestation of capitalist thieves rather than investment.
Yes.
I think we've had at least 2 sinkholes in Liverpool in the last 10 years, which have been due to sewers collapsing. Huge sinkholes where, people there was one residential road I live nearby, people couldn't get down their road for weeks. I think it happened twice. And then there was a major road in Liverpool where it happened. I think, okay, we've got all these campaigns, reception them at water, NHS, you name it. I think we need to go straight to a mass communist socialist party demanding we're going to set up democratic control for everything, because the game's up. This is total, utter corruption. They're killing us. They don't want to provide us. I heard that they're going to allow them to put the bills up by 80%. I think there's been a new development, the water bills. It's just, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Minnie. Who else would like to come in? Do people agree that nationalisation is a bad thing, as it was done in the past, or do people think that's acceptable? And if you don't think it was acceptable, as Nick was asking, what should it be replaced by? How do we run a non kind of private industry and make it democratic? Because we have to have answers to this stuff, People are on the door, we're talking to people, we have to have answers to this stuff. Okay, I'm going to make a suggestion, which is that we basically, there is a, building on what Nick was talking about, there's a march for water, which is taking place on November the 3rd, which is a Sunday in London. And on the March for Water, if you look at their website, you can see that mostly the organisations, and there are hundreds of organisations sponsoring this, are organisations from the environmental world that include mass organisations like the RSPB and organisations like that. There is not, I don't think, a genuine left or socialist organisation to be seen sponsoring that demonstration. And I find that quite surprising. And I think that's something that the left needs to do about, because if we're going to have a public and democratically owned water industry, then we need to build an alliance that's going to be able to bring that about as part of a socialist government. And that alliance needs to be made up of the workers who actually deliver the water in very many different ways. It's got to be the people who use it, both in domestic use and in the sense of people who go anglers, people who go swimming, people who go surfing, people who go sailing, anybody, and anybody who actually likes to use a river or water in any way at all. And so I would hope that, over time, the left can orientate itself to understanding that the water crisis is a crisis that can link together people who are on low incomes and who are going to pay through the nose for water comparative to the size of their incomes, and other people with environmental concerns. And it seems to be the perfect thing where you can bring people together. So I think that's one way of starting it. I think that one of the questions we've got to ask ourselves is, given the case that Nick has put, what has the left been saying about this water crisis? What has anybody heard anything? I haven't, apart from the odd article in a left-wing newspaper, I haven't really heard anything. And why is the left so quiet about it? Okay, Kirsty has got a question for Nick. It's a question for Nick is that with the building of the houses on the Greenbelt, will this affect the water and the sewage?
Can I throw out a question?
Mm.
Does anybody think that regulation will work? And if not, why not? Or if you do, why? Because that's what Labour's answer is. Get rid of Ofwat, replace it by something new, and it will all be better.
Minnie?
Yeah, it's just a quick question. I didn't read the article, but I saw a headline the other day, something about to do with this in the Guardian, that part of the regulation may be that companies aren't allowed to make a profit, water companies. And I wondered if Nick had heard anything about that.
Okay. We've got every day, I did the maths on this actually, and I did the maths on the profits that they've made and the debt that they've built up. And what that means is over 35 years, £10 million a day has gone from the public to the private sector. £10 million every single day. And this is from companies that were given, I mean, as Nick says, it was given away. They did a float where they floated the shares at prices in kind of a behind the scenes deal where at 20% of the price they knew they were going to be sold on for. And they've continued to cream it in ever since. So it's just extraordinary what's happened. And, it is a heist. It's a robbery. It's not a Tell Sid campaign, this one. This is a heist. So Kate's asking, what were the shortcomings of the previous system before privatisation? So what were the shortcomings of the nationalised water system? Were there any? Were people even aware how it was run? Does anybody remember thinking about their water bill? Did anybody remember thinking, well, there should be workers' control of this industry? Were we that bothered? Or did we just turn on the tap and flush the loo and think, okay, that's all working? Hi, Janet.
I don't know if this is relevant really, but actually nationalisation stole the water companies from local authorities. They were under the control of local authorities, so they were municipalised and they were taken away. And my council, when I was leader, we, with about 6 other councils, I think, took the government to court. And it was a very, very long process. We ended up in the highest court, really. And we lost, actually, of course. I can't remember why we lost on a technicality. And I'm not suggesting municipalisation is the answer. I mean, the answer, I guess Nick gave it. But there must have been a reason why, and I can't remember now because it's like a million years ago, why we did go to court. It wasn't just perversity.
Mm.
There was some reason. I mean, there were reasons, a long list of reasons why what was about to happen under nationalisation was actually wrong.
When was that, Janet?
Oh, a long time ago. I mean, I think it was when it was being privatised. I can't actually remember the sequence now, but I mean, the whole thing of it may have been, I think what it was actually, that we were opposing privatisation on the grounds that actually the nationalised industries had no right, had no right to the water anyway, because they took it away from local authorities on incorrect basis, or it was, I don't know what the law was, but I think that's when it happened. So when did privatisation happen? What year was that?
89.
Yeah, so it was that date. So
Okay.
I think we were doing it to prevent privatisation, but we did have a very good case that wasn't just the technical legal case, but was about the benefits of municipalised water companies. Well, clearly, that wasn't going to, we weren't going to win anything, but it was a very big campaign across the country with it was Manchester, I think, who led that. So very large authorities and some medium ones like mine. I'm just throwing that in really. So I mean, maybe we could, you asked the question about, you know, what do people think about nationalised, when it previous system, maybe we can also look back at a previous system to that to see if it actually had some of the characteristics that one might look at in terms of common ownership. Okay.
Were they kind of water boards at local level, at a municipal level? Were the people responsible for running the water for water boards that were elected by, by councillors, or was it like a local quango?
I don't know, because it was before my time. But I mean, it was obviously the municipalization of water or sewage and so on was the foundation of local authorities in, you know, the very early 20th century and so on, because of the absolutely shocking nature of you know, sewage and so on, and the effects on public health. So it was extremely important as a local authority function. How it was done, I don't know. I don't really remember. Obviously, I don't remember because even I'm not that old. But I mean, I think it's worth looking at, you know, some of the reasons why having water under the control of whatever, it may have been the state, the local state, but why that was much better than the kind of private chaos and that we had in, you know, Victorian England and so on. It was extremely important. It was probably the most important thing that happened in local government ever, because it really started, you know, it increased the health of local people manifoldly. I mean, you know, without anything happening before or after, it was the most important thing. I mean, that may be all totally irrelevant, but, you know, it might be interesting to look at.
I do think it's interesting that the most effective campaigning around what's happening to water is done by people who use it in the main, not in a domestic sense. Yeah. And I find that really interesting, that it's the impact of it, of privatization, has come in and affected people. Actually, I mean, of course, lots of working class people go fishing, do angling, do swimming, and all this kind of stuff. But what really struck me was the Oxbridge cruise. You know, there's the race that people watch once a year. I don't really watch it, but last year they came out of the water and said, you know, without as much say, oh, we think we lost because we all had the equivalent of poisoning from, sewage, and they weren't allowed to have their celebration in the water. The winners weren't allowed to have a celebration in the water because they had to go and get a shower. They were told not to celebrate in the water. They were told to go and have a shower, right, to wash the shit off. Is basically what happened. Now this is happening all over the place, and in terms of the campaigns, it's local campaigners who are actually doing the monitoring of water, whether it be lakes, rivers, wherever. And so it's local campaigners who've really brought this to the front. And I think there's a really strong argument for saying that an element of control is for kind of the public being given responsibility with technical professionals to actually look at water quality, both coming out of the taps and in the rivers and in the seas and all over the place, really. So if you were going to have a system of democratic control, the monitoring would have to be democratic as well. It would have to be kind of citizen science. I don't know, I wouldn't be able to work out how the local authority could get engaged in that now. What the local councillor's role would be in that, apart from, I don't know, managing a body that did all that monitoring, did all that kind of citizen science. That might be one way of thinking about, popular control of it.
Well, I mean, obviously, local authorities are now, for the last, I don't know, 8-10 years, are responsible for public health. It's not the NHS, obviously. It's local authorities. So that there's that very direct line, and the directors of public health, must be of very much concern for them. If something goes wrong with water, it could be disastrous. So, I mean, in a way, it is like going back to the pre privatize, or going back. I don't want to go on about it, but I mean, I think there is a very direct link. How that then interprets into or becomes a link to people in communities, I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but it's not as if local authorities are not actually accountable for the public health of their areas. So they would have to be very much in the center, really, of a new system of comprehension. I'm not saying running it, and I'm not saying, but in terms of monitoring and scrutiny and professional expertise, they would be.
So Pete Bloomer, whose name I thought I recognised, and we know each other from about 35 years ago at least, says, yes, there's been a commodification of water from a public right to water to a corrupt financial heist, and it's the end of the welfare state. Privatisation has generally been a massive giveaway of public property to drip feed a failing capitalist economy. It's hard to think of democratic control, as good as that would be, outside of a labour movement that projects such radical ideas like air pollution, water pollution needs to be checked on. Yeah. I mean, the medics are, the health service are very interested in water now, aren't they? Because there's been research done. The BMJ published something by John Middleton and Patrick Saunders in May this year that looked at the number of people being admitted to hospital from waterborne infections, and it's gone up from 2,000 in 2010-11 to well over 3,000 10 years later. And these people, these two researchers, Middleton and Saunders, say, where is the outrage? Where is the professional concern about this disaster? Because what they know as health epidemiologists is under the top of the peak of that, and that's the people who are ending up with serious illness in hospital. There's a huge amount of people who are getting ill from water when they're going into the water in the sea or in the rivers. Minnie says, I agree, Peter, we need clean air as well. I didn't quite get the last bit, Minnie. You might have to come in on that.
Yeah, especially with COVID and the virus. I mean, there's still 200 people, my understanding, dying a week from COVID. It just isn't in the news, and mostly older people. But there is there are air purifiers that can be installed. There are air conditioning systems that can purify the air. I think that it's been done at Westminster. Hey, in the Palace of Westminster, that's been done. There is UV light that can be at the the top of the ceiling in buildings that can clear up to 99% of virus. There's all sorts of things, and we've got the air pollution, we've got the traffic pollution. So like water, that how they solved cholera by plumbing and cleaning the water. So we need to do the same with the air, but as one comrade has said, we're going backwards with water. I think it was Janet. That the health of the population. This profit thing above everything. I mean, surely the gig's up. I don't understand why people aren't. Well, we need a mass party. We need a mass party, and we need to organise. And one thing we need to do is just to list all the ways the ruling class are killing us, basically, are making us ill. I mean, that's huge, and stealing from us. It's massive.
Nick, would you like to come in?
I'm just going to. I don't have answers to a lot of the questions that have been asked, I'm afraid. My knowledge my knowledge of the history of water ownership is limited. I know that you go back several centuries, the private water companies would have provided water to London and places like that. But you then did get, at the end of the 19th century, a movement in favour of municipalisation of water and gas and electricity then followed. And it became known, or it's known historically, as gas and water socialism. But one of the prime motivators for it was a liberal capitalist, Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham. So not necessarily a socialistic proposition, but you can see why it was an advance that municipal production of water to improve the health was a good thing. And it does raise a question in my mind, and I'd be interested in what other people say. If you look around at buildings from the 19th century, and you look at the way that town halls in the north, for example, were built in all the mill towns where massive sums of money were made from textiles and slavery, they built these buildings to last. And it does strike me that in its heyday, capitalism, or British capitalism, when it had an empire and it was bringing money in from all over the world, had a confidence in its future as a system. Whereas now, I don't think the ruling class does have that same confidence in the future. And it's almost as if the last Tory government and the capitalist class as a whole are looking essentially to ransack the wardrobes, cupboards, chests of drawers and everything else, and taking stuff away as quickly as they can, because they don't expect it to last forever. And also, there might be some exceptions, but they have given up, have they not, on the question of the climate? Have they given up on the question of water? Do they care? I'm sure there are some capitalists who see the necessity of having clean water to ensure that there's a population and we don't have health crises and so on, but there doesn't seem to be much argument for it. So I think there is something in that no longer, the capitalist class no longer has confidence in its own system. And to an extent, you saw that under COVID, where basically, people were dishing out contracts. The Tory government cabinet were dishing out contracts to people right, left and centre, to their mates, not really caring about the public purse, which lost billions and billions and billions, giving it away to their friends. But I think the points that have been made by Minnie and Janet about water and its importance. I mean, it is. I had it in my speech, but I didn't have time to get to it. I describe it as shameful. It's a disgrace, really, that the Labour movement has not taken up this question of water, because there's nothing more essential, is there, than water. We need it to survive, even on an hourly basis. We need it for cleanliness. 67 million people, the amount of effluent that we produce, and it's being dumped into our rivers and seas without a care, from the people in power, at least. And it is interesting that these other groups that Will's described are concerned, and there's mass anger from all of these groups, who make up quite a cogent force, a powerful force. But if you look at the website for the demonstration, for example, there's some very good material about what's wrong and what's going wrong, but there are no answers. It doesn't even call for nationalisation under capitalism, so it doesn't even call for nationalisation now. I'm sure some people would call for that, and in my opinion, that would be an advance, although it's not the answer. I'd be interested if people disagree with me on that. What the municipal water companies and their transference, I just looked up quickly, and I saw that there was an act in 1973 to bring those regional water boards under national governance, and I can't remember now, but a whole number of regional water boards had been created. They were what was went on to be privatized. But Engels, when he wrote his book Anti-Düring, he referred to the growing concentration of capital and the combination of capital, and he pointed to an era in which he anticipated or expected, looking around the world at the time as well, that the capitalist class would no longer be able to sustain some aspects of production and services, and that these would essentially be taken over by the capitalist state and run by the capitalist state. And he saw that as making it easier for the socialist movement to take over into their own hands the state-owned property. That first of all, it becomes state property of the capitalists, it then becomes state property of the new workers' state, and essentially the state disappears, and we come up with new forms of ownership, governance, management, and so on, which are yet to be decided. There does seem to be a very strong argument, does there not, in favor of things like energy and water and health and transport to be centralized and then farmed out for local management. So, for example, I mentioned about the lack of reservoirs. There's not been a reservoir built since 1992 in Derbyshire. We're leaking huge amounts of water, billions of litres, because the pipes aren't fixed. Southern Water had this plan earlier this year to hire ships which would go to Norway and would bring back Norwegian fjord water, which was runoff from the melting glaciers in Norway, and bring it back to Southampton and fit it into the water grid. It seems incredible that we have all of these different regional water companies, but no nationally integrated system for how to move water about, how to store it, how to share it. So there's lots of discussion there, it seems to me, about what we could do or how we could do it. But the question is, or a question for Minnie and for others. Why is it that the Labour movement, the socialist movement, has essentially ignored water? I mean, you could argue that it was quite slow and still is coming to the question of climate catastrophe. But it does show also that changing the world, changing society actually does address the big issues. It's not just about, well, it's not even about how to get a better pay rise or, you know, a better pension or how you pay less or more tax. It's about the whole way in which the society and the economy is run, in whose interests. And I think the old slogan, "You can't control what you don't own," is a good one. The people that benefit from the private ownership of the water companies are the private owners of the water companies. There was a recent article in the Financial Times that looked at the structure of the water companies and looked at the way that it's using a model for a lot of monopoly provision. So energy, water, and so on. And once you have that private ownership, the companies who run them, they know, because it's a monopoly and it's absolutely necessary for the reasonably good functioning of society, they know that they've got the government over a barrel. And so this is one of the reasons why I think regulation is completely inadequate. It's nowhere near enough, because Ofwat, you know, it gets all of these requests, whether it's 80%, 77%, 44% increase in water bills, ostensibly to pay for repairing the pipes, which they haven't done for 35 years. But Ofwat knows that if it doesn't allow the prices to rise, then nothing whatsoever will take place. On the other hand, we know that it'll just go to fund the shareholders' dividends. So there's a huge crisis in the way that we look at the economy and the provision of services. And one last question before I finish. It's always seemed to me that arguing against the profit motive in the provision of essential services like water is pretty easy, because I think most ordinary people understand that nobody should make a profit from providing you with water, because it's a basic necessity of life. Just as most people, I think it still is the case, most people would agree that nobody should profit from providing you with healthcare. But my question is, do people here agree that we should also be arguing for other aspects of the economy to be run on the same basis, i.e. not for profit, but for need? Or is that a more difficult argument to make?
Okay. What do people think? Soraya?
Well, question really, why do you think, I mean, apart from the fact that the trade union leadership and bureaucrats have relinquished any responsibility, why do you think there is this absolute silence? I mean, it's almost treated as if it's something sort of middle class thing, and I don't really understand it, because it is so vital to our existence in every single way that I'm just at a loss as to why, because at the same time it's such an easy thing to raise as being a problem. You'd think that the people who the workers who work in the sector would have a lot to say about what they see as wrong, and I don't understand, if anybody can explain to me why it is there is this absolute absence, and it's treated as if it's some sort of middle class issue that really is a sort of hobby thing rather than a basic necessity.
Mini.
Yeah, obviously capitalism goes to monopoly. We have monopolies, we have cartel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, can you hear
Yes.
me? Oh,
Yes.
sorry. Yeah. Capitalism goes to monopoly. We have cartels of energy companies, which is a monopoly. But Labour is planning to build new reservoirs, but they're going to use private finance initiative, which is going to benefit the banks. So for every pound the government invests, we invest, it's going to cost an extra £5, possibly. It's so much more expensive. This that people, I don't understand why there is so much silence. I can't get my head around why there's so much silence on COVID. I saw some stats today about sickness in the NHS. The NHS they said it's the seventh largest employer in the world, and the sickness stats at the moment they've gone huge. Apparently, there's a wave. There's a massive wave of COVID going on. Loads of people in hospital at the moment, and that is because they're not cleaning the air, and there was no infection control. And it's so dangerous. I mean, it's going to be in our water. Obviously parasites, etc., because they're not servicing our water infrastructure. It's crazy. It needs to be in the democratic control of people. But we need engineers and experts, but the people need to say what they want. We all need to say what we want.
Yeah. I mean, my view is there's kind of three things. I mean, I think there's two or three things going on. The first one is that although I think we're going back to Victorian times. Yeah, I think that's what's happening. I think there's an attempt to drive us as far back as possible to pre-Labour Party times, before the gas and water socialism, actually, and to push us as far as they can back to privatise everything, absolutely everything that they can possibly get away with privatising, because that's in the nature of the beast. It's not somebody waking up thinking I'm going to be really wicked this morning and take this or that out of public hands. It's the nature of the capitalist system requires that happens. But I think that because they're always seeking for new areas to make profits. That's the point, wherever they can find it. Yeah. So as an example, I saw on Facebook the other day in one of the hospitals, they are hiring out wheelchairs for £5 or £2 or whatever it is. It doesn't matter how much it is, but they're hiring them out. So if you can afford it, you can have a wheelchair, right? So they're privatizing as much as they can. And this is driving us back to pre-welfare state times was the first objective. And I think, pre-Second World War and even further back is as far as they want to go. But the point about the monopolies that we face now is that they're global monopolies. These are hedge funds, global investment systems, and global investment markets that are feeding off social need in countries across the world. So it's a kind of a different. I do get what Engels is saying, but it's now a kind of a different dynamic. This is an international phenomena of privatization of lots and lots of water. Really, it's going on all over the world, and so challenging it in one country is important and will set an example. That's the point to the rest of the world, that it can be challenged, and we can challenge capital, which is why we need to do that. But capitalism does not respect the limits of the environment and how to protect the environment and how to look after it to the benefit of everybody, because that's just not what it's there for. It's there to make a profit. So, for example, Monbiot, who is a person who frankly annoys me because he knows a lot and refuses to point to capitalism as the source of the problems he's talking about. He talks about the absence of regulation of chicken producers, you shouldn't call them farmers, you should call them producers, because there are sites that hold up to 20 million chickens that have been built down the River Wye that are poisoning the River Wye because they don't care. There's no regulation of it. You don't even need to have planning permission to do this now. And it is poisoning over 70 miles of the River Wye. And so if it's happening there, they will try and get away with it almost everywhere that they can get away with it, because regulation under capitalism means that it gives capital the space to just eke away at regulatory controls, and they will always come back to that, which is why I think regulation won't work, really, because, you know, capital will always find a way around it and always does. And talking about going back to Victorian times, that was, of course, the time when there was the Great Stink in the River Thames that produced the original kind of public concern, and it was because it was stinking out Parliament about keeping water clean. That's why they were worried about it. They called it the Great Stink. Dickens wrote about it. And at the same time, there was the cholera outbreak in Soho in that same period. And John Snow was the medic who discovered that it was a water pipe that was actually leading to the illness in the Soho area. And so I think we're going back to it. We will be going back to a time where people will be getting iller. Water will degrade in quality. We'll see more local incidents of water systems not working because they will try and reduce the quality of the provision as far as they can. And I read a very curious article. Since you mentioned Engels, Nick, we don't normally mention Marx and Engels by name, but since you mentioned Engels, who would be working 100 yards away down the road from that the water stand that John Snow sourced the illness to, but Marx and Engels? And it's pretty certain, actually, that they were there getting some water from there. So historically, that was a massively close call because it did kill a lot of people. Anyway, I'll stop on that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was just saying, I don't really feel I know enough. But it just seems obvious. It just seems, it can't be left to the 1%. So there has to be a better way.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to, something you were saying about going back to Victorian times. Like, I feel quite guilty because I don't think I've paid enough attention to the water, actually. And there have been campaigns locally about what's happening in the sea and stuff, because I live by the sea. But the thing about possibly forcing people to have injections so they can reduce their body fat, that Starmer and Wes Streeting and other people have been talking about, so they can be fit for work, that issue. And then, I mean, this has been going on a long time because I was involved in campaigns in this in the early 90s, and I was very unwell and using a wheelchair, so it really affected me, all that pressure of feeling that you would lose your benefit. But it seems to have become so even more extreme and so kind of shameless,
Mm-hmm.
that you just prepared to experiment on people. And as you say, and people who are so vulnerable and probably have so little resources to fight back, that all these things are linked. The water thing, the general health is linked to the kind of exploitation of people who are ill, using them. I don't think it's realistic thinking these people can find jobs and go to work. It's kind of using them as a scapegoat to frighten and terrify everybody else. And so that's what it just made me think of. And I think you were so right to say it's a kind of holistic problem. So it has to be dealt with in a mass way, really, doesn't it? Of the, as I think Nick was saying, about ordinary people having control. But I don't feel very I don't feel like I really know what I'm talking about. It's just kind of a gut reaction. The thing I know about is being ill and how terrifying that, has been for me, and seeing other people and trying to do something about it, the suffering of other people, because of that pressure about work. And that's all about profit of private companies.
Mm,
So I haven't
yeah.
really got anything else to say.
Okay. All right. Soraya?
Don't we have to argue for nationalisation? I mean, it's explaining, isn't it, how to make it work, rather who controls it. The problem is, isn't it, that you shouldn't have private control of, well, obviously I'm want to get rid of capitalism, and we need to explain that, but it's surely there must be a demand for a nationalised water system, just as the health system and so forth, but explaining how it can be controlled, that it has to be controlled by us, and not by quangos or people who just don't, there's no input into that control, and that's where or rather the input that's there is a very small number of people, and it's not the decision of the people who use the services. I'm not saying it's a simple formulation, but I don't think the fact that it hasn't worked, that it's been bureaucratic mismanaged in the past, is a reason to abandon the demand, or is that just a sort of an old-fashioned way of looking at it? I don't. What's the alternative? The alternative is that it's all divided up, and in the plunder, the plot, the profit. It's a completely unbridled profit motive, isn't it? That we are seeing now. There's no sort of pretense of hiding anything. I mean, which just, again, just for me reflects how utterly spineless the union leaders are, and of course Labour Party is just rushing to do capitalism's job for it.
Janet?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the silence. I'm not sure it's actually been totally silent. I mean, when people were talking, and we're talking about nationalisation here and not about common ownership, but I mean, in terms of the left, it's usually, water, gas, energy, and so on. I don't think it's left out of that. And there's been, there's not a silence, but a lack of effectiveness, as always, with the left, during the Corbyn years, really, but later, much worse. But I was just thinking about where there is, I don't know if it's silence, but there's so much academic work and health, public health and so on, around the issue of health inequalities. A lot of excellent work, all of which really has been dumped by successive governments, by the Labour Party, clearly by the Tories, so that we're going, in terms of life expectancy, we're going backwards for the first time in how many years. But when you think about water, however bad the situation is in terms of infrastructure and high costs and unfairness, it doesn't as yet have the same direct impact as, for example, air pollution, where there has been quite a lot of public concern about deaths of children, for example. You can't say the same thing about water. I mean, maybe, things get worse. There will be some kind of scandal or outcry, but so maybe that, looking at, I did a lot of work on health inequalities. I don't think water, certainly it did outside this country, and globally it's a massive issue. But if you look at wealth here and income issues, water, people being access to water and so on is not denied any more for poor people as for rich people and so on. So it has to be, I think, looked at in a different way, in a different kind of perspective, because to use your imagination, I mean, one's imagination about how things could gradually, or even not gradually, where it does become an issue around health inequalities, but I don't think it has done so far. And the guy you mentioned, Middleton, wasn't it, one of you? It's very interesting. So if he said anything about this, I think it's worth looking at. He's very good on the health inequalities.
Yeah, I know Middleton. It's in the British Medical Journal in May. It's really, really interesting. I mean, I think taking on Sarah's point, why isn't there more interest in it? And don't think about what you've just said there, Janet, which is that you turn your tap on, or you flush your loo, or you do some cooking or whatever, and a bill comes through, and you can be annoyed about the bill, but it doesn't really make you think of what should we do about this bill, does it? I mean, and people on low income still get water if they can't pay their bills. Yeah. That's why I'm wondering whether the left has missed a trick in terms of water quality and, people's experience of what's happening to nature and the possibility of building an alliance with people who are worried about the environment. Because workers in the water industry, there's no reason why they shouldn't be worried about the industry they're working in being so poor that it's actually poisoning fish in rivers, which is what's happening. It's killing lots and lots of fish. Shouldn't be worried about people not being able to swim in the water. Shouldn't be worried about people not being able to enjoy the lakes, because workers do all that stuff as well. And we have missed a trick if we cannot build an alliance, I think, between the workers in the industry and the people who are worried about the use of water and the despoilation of water and rivers and other things like that, and the consumers who are being asked to pay for more. So there's an alliance there, I think, that could be built and that could raise an issue of concern. And I'm going to the March for Water demo, right? And I'm not expecting to see much of the left on it. And it should be. Because, if one of the organisers, sort of says, we call on the government to end the environmental devastation being inflicted upon our river, lakes and seas. It stops here, it stops now, stops today. It's now time to hold to account those industries that for far too long now have been allowed to knowingly and wantonly pollute our waters, driven by nothing more than profit and greed. Yeah? That's a statement made by the well-known revolutionary Fergal Sharkey. They are raising issues that we should be engaged in. The workers' movement should be engaged in this, should be on that demo, should be talking to all those people, whatever class they're from, because as it points out, capital cannot run this, cannot look after nature that they enjoy. Another system could, but this one can't. Anyway, I'm going to stop here, Nick.
Okay, so I think that's an excellent point to finish on, because some people come to socialist ideas through a myriad of ways, and mostly it's experience. Maybe they'll have heard some of the arguments, or maybe not, but experience. And these people that are joining this coalition on the impact of pollution to the water system of Britain are drawing conclusions, and that statement that you just read out is drawing a conclusion that the people responsible are people who are driven by profit. And it's not such a big step to draw the conclusion that what you need is to get rid of the profit system. And I think that's really important. It's a way that if socialists were active and organised and focused, we could make huge impact and win lots of people on the issue of this pollution of the rivers and waterways, whether they're surfers or fishers or swimmers or whatever. We could win them directly to the idea that we need a transformation, a fundamental break with capitalism, and the creation of a new system which would protect the waterways and the life in it and the land around it. And Minnie's point, which we always raise in these discussions, is what we are lacking is a party of ordinary working class people who can discuss these ideas, work out how to present the arguments, and can talk to their mates, their workmates, their families about it, and can intervene. I mean, if we had even 12 people on that demo giving out a card with a few simple points about the profit system is destroying our water. The answer is a different form of society, one that we control. I think it would be extremely well received and we might get some interest. The other point that I just want to, because one of the things that struck me when I was doing some work on preparing my talk was lots of stuff I had to leave out, but how water, because it is such a necessity of life, because it is so integral to everything, you can't think about public ownership of water without thinking about everything else. I mean, say you have control, we have democratic control of the sewage system and water. What do we do about the farmland on which all of these pollutant fertilizers are spread, which when it rains find their way into the water system? Does that not mean that we need to have public ownership, common ownership of the land, and that we have to have democratic control, management and planning of how farming is carried out? So we need common ownership of the land, not just the water. We need common ownership of the minerals in the land so that we've got control over what takes place on the land and that might impact on the water. It's all integrated. If we're talking about replenishing the Victorian or maybe later infrastructure of the sewage and water system, then I think Minnie mentioned we need engineers, but we need machines, we need labor, we need technology, we need science, we need all sorts of things to be able to dig holes, to put down pipes, to make sure that they don't, they're not caustic or pollutants. So does that not mean that we have to have management and control over the production of machinery so that we can make sure that we have enough machinery, that we have to have control and management, which means ownership of science and technology so that we can monitor and improve things. One of the remarkable things which I found, and it struck me because there's been a lot of discussion in recent times about artificial intelligence and the massive growth in the data centers that basically run these huge computers to produce the artificial intelligence that is being now produced. These data centers consume huge amounts of water. So if I can find the, okay, so data centers for artificial intelligence, the cloud, predicted to grow. The number of data centers will reach almost 5,700 by the end of 2024 and 8,400 by 2030. And they consume vast amounts of water. And in the Financial Times in August of this year, it said the US state of Virginia is home to the world's largest concentration of data centers, including facilities used by Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And water consumption has jumped by 2/3 since 2019. That's just 5 years, because they need the water to cool those data centers. Tens of billions is being invested into these data centers by big tech. And actually, it's depleting the amount of water that's available elsewhere in the region. So it affects everything. And once you start examining it, I mean, it's remarkable that somebody like George Monbiot doesn't draw all of the strands of his arguments together and come to the conclusion that what we need is a revolution, because capitalism cannot solve any of the problems that we face, even in the short term. certainly not in the long term. So I agree with Will that we're heading back to the Victorian times. I mean, when I was looking at the pollution of the rivers and so on, it reminded me, perhaps it's an exaggeration, I don't know, but it reminded me of Engels writing about the conditions of the working class in England and the pollution in the Manchester and Salford rivers from the textile mills and so on. And capitalism did, to an extent, find a way out of that. But now it's going back. And it doesn't seem to have any answers apart from make hay while the sun shines and who cares what happens when we're dead? Well, we do care. And that's why we need to build our mass socialist party. And on that, I do hope some of you will be able to come to the meeting that we're having on the 16th of November in Manchester. So in a few weeks' time, to discuss some of these issues in perhaps more detail, but face to face, which would be much more pleasant. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Nick. And if we'll send a bulletin out again with the details of that meeting. Thanks, Nick, for the presentation. I think it's good sometimes to have a meeting and a conversation where we're exposing gaps in our knowledge and also having to think really hard about what is it that we want and how do we do it. And I think that can be a useful conversation. And I think we've made some progress on that this evening, and we need to do some more thinking about it. And also thinking about the alliances that can be built. I will be writing a very brief report about my sojourn to the March for Water on November the 3rd. If you are there, say hello to me. If not, I will write a report that you can all look at, and we can consider, the next steps forward. I'm organising with some other socialists a conference on socialism and post-capitalist and socialist societies in the environment in London. There's an article about that on the website, and if you're interested in that, you should come. It's on December the 7th. 2 other dates for your diary. In a fortnight, we'll be discussing the outcome of which election? The United States election. Hold on to your hats, people. And that, I'm sure, is going to be an interesting discussion. And also then a fortnight later, we will be returning to our discussion of what's happening in the Middle East, where we will be giving Moshe Machover a bit more than the usual 15 minutes to do an introduction, because he gave a really interesting and knowledgeable, full of detail introduction last year. And so we're asking him to come back, and frankly, it was impossible to keep him to 15 minutes. So I'm going to tell him 15 and then it'll be half an hour. It'd be great to see you there for that one, because there's still a lot of stuff I'm sure you're aware to talk about and discuss, and issues to tease out. And I think it's important that we have a place here where people can tease out discussion and differences and thoughts about that. So it'd be great to see you there. So thanks to everybody for attending. I would raise a glass of water to you, but I don't have one by my side. And I will see you next time. Yeah, you've got one. Hurrah. And even better. And I will see you all next time.